Hey everyone, Tony D with a hot take on memes. So Tim Pool today was doing a pretty interesting topic. One of the things he touched upon was the idea that the left can't meme, and he had a thought, and I thought this was interesting, that the reason people on the left side of politics can't meme is because they are too fractured, right? They all believe different things. Whereas on the right, they're mostly together, they're mostly consistent, and therefore they can meme. I'd like to expand upon that and clarify that some more. And the reason it struck me is because I say a very similar thing about comedy, right? And memes tend to be funny. And comedy is about a shared experience. If you don't have a shared experience, the comedy doesn't usually connect. So that's part of the reason that the right can meme and the left can't. Most people on the right have a shared experience because they hold the same traditional values, roundly speaking. They tend to be, if not religious, at least respectful to religion. They tend to believe in traditional relationships, even if they're not, say, straight. They believe in sort of traditional marriages. And for the most part, they kind of go in similar directions, even though they may disagree on some tiny details at this juncture in history. That wasn't always the case, but now that's the case. Whereas people on the right are completely, or people on the left are completely fractured. Now, why are they fractured is what I want to expand upon. I believe that they're fractured because as they push further left, the ideology has no limits, and it is an ideology which says anyone could be anything at any time. Additionally, there's some postmodernism that's in there that basically deconstructs everything, which feeds into that. But I think, I've talked to some older Democrats who they hate Trump. They absolutely hate Trump. They're not voting for him. But, when I tell them about things that their side of the political spectrum now believes. So, for instance, I was telling someone who's an older Democrat, I said, I got into a political argument with someone on the left, but I easily defeated them by asking them the question, what is a woman? And they couldn't define that. And this older Democrat was like, well, that's ridiculous. Why couldn't they do that? See, they don't understand the argument that's going on the left side of politics. And that is, in the extreme left, there's an argument about transgender people. And they can't make up their mind what the limit is. They can't make up their mind that, okay, we have to have either a separate category for trans women athletes, or we can't let trans women compete in women's sports or whatever. They can't come to an agreement. They're fighting over it. They don't know what to do. Their default setting is just to support all marginalized people all the time. And when those marginalized people disagree, they don't know how to react to that. I think it's partly because the people who are in charge of the left side of politics are mostly not in those marginalized groups. And because they're not in there, they don't really have a response. And the handful of people that are in those marginalized groups, well, they have very strong opinions, right? So you have, for instance, a lot of people in the African American community are pretty religious, whether you're Republican or Democrat. So, you've been a Democrat all your life, but you're also deeply religious. That can conflict because a lot of people on the left now more than ever say, religion doesn't matter. Religion is, you should ignore religion. And, that is, they make fun of people who are religious. And that doesn't jibe if you're a person who is religious and believes in God or whatever. Now, I'm agnostic, so count me out. But I could understand the conflict there. Like, you're trying to be in this group of people who you believe with on policy, but, on another angle, they just constantly denigrate you for your religious beliefs, believing that they're a hindrance rather than a help to the cause. And more and more, the politicization, I think, has been a politicization of the left into two categories, which is the sort of central lefties, I guess you'd call them the neoliberals, and the extreme lefties, who are like, they're out there. They believe in, it's not just extreme policy, but they also believe in extreme things socially. They've taken their ideology to the extreme. They've taken like, well, we have to accept, all people of all sexual relations, including, there was a time where liberals were horrified by the idea of polygamy, right? The idea that these religious groups in Utah would have multiple wives, they were horrified by it. Now you have people who have gone so far left, they are pushing polyamory relationships. Now, granted, there's some differences in there, but, if you turn around and apply the same logic to, say, a polyamorous relationship, and somebody who wants multiple wives and says, well, all my wives are entering into this, relationship voluntarily, and they're of age, then, the people who hold those extreme views have to concede that point. Although they don't, because they're extremists and they don't concede anything that isn't in view of their ideology, but they would logically have to in terms of a policy. You couldn't say legalize polyamory and keep polygamy out of the mix. They're too close. So I think the reason that the left can't meme is because their ideology keeps them fractured. Their ideology says everything's right. There is no traditions. And again, this goes to postmodernism. Postmodernism is about deconstructing everything to nothing. So if everything's equal and everything's acceptable for every person at any time, at any place, then nothing matters. No borders matter. No borders, not just the physical borders around the country, but the borders between men and women, between people of different ages, between people, different social classes. None of that matters. And you get this complete blurring of all the lines, and people don't function under that. If you're on the left and you're trying to navigate relationships or policy or whatever, you need some kind of core values. And if your core values are just kind of all over the place and meaningless ultimately, because I think, extreme leftists would say, well, core values are meaningless. They don't mean anything. Nothing means anything. So that's why they can't meme. They don't have a shared value that they can even parody. There's no sense of humor in that, because comedy is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's a very sort of nihilistic view of things. The further you push left. Now, if you stay, if you're a neoliberal or just a moderate centrist Democrat, you can stay in a place that makes sense. You could stay in a moderate place and say, well, I'm pro-choice, but I think after 6 months a woman shouldn't get an abortion. They should go through a different process of adoption and perhaps some government subsidy to help the woman, give up their kid or whatever. There are reasonable people can come to some sort of middle ground that we could all live with, right? So I'm pretty sure that most moderate Republicans could come to some sort of middle ground on, say, the abortion issue and say, well, you know, abortion would be, there'd be no question of an abortion in case of rape and incest, and up to, you know, whatever month. Let's say it's 3 or 4 months, something like that. If, you know, on the other side of that equation, they were willing to give, say, some sort of government subsidies so that the woman who's poor and gets pregnant and then doesn't get an abortion in time can then get some kind of you know, government stipend until she gives birth and you know, gives up the baby and goes back to work or whatever. I think there's a middle ground there, but we're not having that discussion because, well, politics aren't very honest in any time, but right now it's just no one's even discussing anything. Trump has won, but part of his winning strategy has been to poke at the left's foibles, and their egos won't allow them to come to the table anymore. And so we kind of have on one side the right, which are people without, say, such big egos, which tends to be working class people, which is why I think more and more working class people are going right. And then on the left, we have these sort of people with big egos. Tends to be richer people, tends to be celebrities. It tends to be people in the public eye or who think they're in the public eye, like the people on Twitter and Tumblr and Reddit. They think they're famous, even though they're kind of only internet famous, maybe. So I think that's part of the reason why the ideology on the left cannot allow them to meme. They don't have a sense of humor. They don't have a shared experience. And comedy really isn't a value to them. You know, I post my comics on places like Imgur and Reddit all the time. And some of the comments I get are just, you know, they're just ridiculously mean. Now, I'm not hurt by them anymore. I guess I was way back in the day, maybe in the 90s, when I post something and get blasted. But, you know, these days I just roll with it because it's happened so many times. I'm just numb to it. But it's just fascinating to see that people will go out of their way to insult you and your work, which says more about them than it does about your work. You know, when you have somebody screaming about the president in your, you know, I have the anti-war comic today. I'm going to post that. I will definitely have people screaming about politics, and I will get down votes. In Imgur, I'll get voted right down to about -12 with like 3 or 4 upvotes. And, you know, that's typical for the anti-war comic now. Anything political, the people on the other side of the equation, or people who feel that they're on the other side of the equation, they don't really understand. They don't bother to look that closely. The moment they see anything that disagrees with them, oh, it must be destroyed. It must be voted down and chastised, because that's kind of the way they've been trained. They've been trained to go, no, you don't let these people get in a word. They'll get you. These right-wingers, or whatever you call me, I'm a libertarian. Anybody who disagrees with you must be attacked immediately. And that's kind of what they do, and they've been trained to do. But in that training, they also attack their own. So, you know, even when I agree with them ostensibly, the anti-war comic is something liberals used to really, really agree with, you know? No, not anymore, man. It's just, you know, when I was making fun of Obama for drone bombing people, you know, I would get the same sort of, you know, angry assessments. And there'd be a few moderate Democrats who would agree, but a lot of them would just be, yeah, no, that's not true. That's not what he does. He has to do that. Would you rather have boots on the ground? You know, it's these false equivalencies or choices that really don't exist. So if you're on the left and you're watching this video and you're all psyched to criticize me. I would say to yourself, what are your core values? Can you even list them? You know, what are your limits? Is there a limit to anything for anyone for any reason? I think you should think about that, because I believe in limits. You know, not limiting, you know, nice people who do nice things, but you know what I mean. There are limits. There are limits. An 85-year-old man probably shouldn't be, you know, a bouncer at a bar, right? Like, that would be a limit. You know, you're 85. Even if you're in really amazing shape for an 85-year-old, I don't think you should be a bouncer at a bar. You know, I think there should be another role for you. If you're, you know, you could still be in security, you could still check the ID, but you'd need like a kid with muscle to actually, you know, to push people out of the bar. Like, that would be a limit. So we have to agree on some kind of general limits. Do you have limits? I ask you, if you're on the left, what are your limits?